Project management is all about facilitating the empirical process. Be transparent and encourage and facilitate transparency in others. Look at what's going on. Encourage others to look at what's going on. Change what you and your team do in light of what you see. And then a quote from Albert Camus. Seeking what is true is not seeking what is desirable. Empirical isn't a common word, but empirical process refers to something that we're all doing all day, every day. All day, every day, we change what we're doing in response to what we see and experience through our senses. And that's what the word empirical means. It means relating to experience in the real world. It's a slightly odd word that doesn't sound as down to earth and practical as it is. For years, I've run training courses to introduce people to agile ideas. Because empirical is a slightly strange word, there's an exercise that I often do where I get people to look up the word and to discuss what it means. Then we do exercises. The exercises often involve Lego. I give the team a bunch of Lego models. I ask them to estimate how many models they can build in a short, fixed space of time. These short, fixed amounts of time are called iterations in Agile. Almost always, at the end of the first iteration, the team realize that they can't do as many models in the time as they initially thought. So partway through the exercise, this forces the teams to do something different based on new experience. Either they reduce their estimates of the number of models they can build, or possibly simplify the models. At the end of the exercise, I come back to this word empirical. Empirical means based on experience. That is the key point that I'm trying to get across in this exercise. Learning from experience is important. Modifying what you do in light of what happens is a fundamental approach to controlling and improving your performance. And this doesn't just apply to your performance, it also applies to the performance of projects. What are we doing every day that's so vital? What we're doing is honoring what are referred to as the three pillars of the empirical process: transparency, inspection, and adaptation. When are we doing this? All the time. But one time when we're especially doing it, that I'm going to use as an example, is when we're driving a car. Imagine that you're driving a car. The first thing that you need is transparency. You need to be able to see out of the windscreen. If the windscreen is covered in mud or being washed with buckets of rain or frosted up with ice, that's bad. And it isn't just looking forward that's important. You'd like to be able to see behind you through your mirrors. So the wing mirrors need to be there and the back windscreen needs to be clear. When you're driving, before you even start moving, you need transparency. And if you don't have it, things can go wrong very fast. But transparency isn't enough. If you're driving, it isn't enough for the windscreen to be clear. You still need to actually look out of it. You need to look out of the windscreen and check your mirrors. If instead, say, you're checking your messages on your phone or distracted and trying to brush scalding hot coffee out of your lap, that's no good. Transparency isn't enough by itself. You need inspection as well. We're focusing here on the visual aspects of driving, but we know that when you're driving, you're also really checking with your other senses. If you feel an unusual vibration accompanied by a dull thudding sound, there's a good chance that you'll slow down. If you smell petrol or burning, you'll probably slow down. If you hear police sirens, you'll check in your rearview mirror and check if the police seem to be interested in you. If they are, you'll probably either speed up if you're in the middle of committing a bank robbery, or if you're doing nothing to be ashamed of, you'll probably slow down. So inspection isn't just a visual thing, it's paying attention with all the senses. Talking about slowing down and speeding up brings us to the third pillar of the empirical process: adaptation. What we're doing when we slow down is adapting. That's also what we're doing when we speed up because we see that the road is clear. It's also what we do when we swerve to avoid something or put the fog lights on when it's foggy. Adaptation is when we change what we're doing because of what we sense, what we see, hear, and feel. Notice how, for these aspects of empirical control to work, they have to be arranged correctly. They are dependent on each other. We can't drive successfully without transparency. If the windscreen were covered in mud, we would not see things that we needed to avoid. We couldn't do it without inspection. If we didn't look up from our texting and see the thing we were about to hit, we wouldn't feel the need to swerve. And finally, we wouldn't be swerving if it weren't for adaptation. All of these things together are empirical process. At this point, I might mention that I've crashed 2 cars. So nobody is going to say that I'm an expert on driving, but I am an expert on what these principles of empirical process mean for software development teams. Let's start with transparency. What does transparency mean for software development teams? Well, I'm afraid it means meetings. There are at least 3 meetings that add transparency into the software development process. Edit. Let's start with transparency. Oops. Sorry, that's a repeat. The stand-up is a short meeting that all of the members of the team have every working day. Each member of the team says what they did the previous working day, what they're going to do today, and highlights anything that's blocking them. It's pretty obvious how this maps back to the driving analogy and empirical process. The stand-up has all the pillars of the empirical process. It has transparency. Members of the team are telling each other what they're doing and pointing out any problems that they're having with it. It has inspection. Well, it has inspection so long as the team members are listening to what other members are saying. And the stand-up is also a crucial opportunity for adaptation. When they hear about the progress or lack of progress of other members of the team, it then becomes relatively natural for the team to change their behavior in response to what they hear, to adapt, either by focusing on the problem and fixing it, or understanding that the problem can't be fixed right now or ever, and routing around it. Members of the team should let others know what they're doing, what they're going to do in the daily stand. Sorry, let's try again. Members of the team should let others know what they're doing, what they're going to do in the daily stand-up. Edit. And they should also point out any problems they are experiencing. Another meeting that implements the 3 pillars of empirical process is a retrospective. In retrospectives, the team looks in the rearview mirror. They look at the road behind them and talk about what progress they have made down it. And they have time to reflection, edit, the things that block their path. They get to talk about how they could have dealt with the obstructions more easily. What things they've got the hang of now, that means what next time they might be able to tackle obstacles faster in the future, edit. They also get to talk about the things that they still have no idea how to handle, the obstacles that are still in the way and the things that are still slowing them down. The final Agile meeting that implements the pillars of the empirical process is the show and tell. I'm not sure what the reason is, but this is a meeting that goes by a lot of different names, all of them which mean the same thing: show and tell, sprint demo, or showcase. The show and tell is a regular demonstration of working software that shows exactly the real progress that the team are making. And of course, that can really be a problem. The first ever Agile software development project that I worked on was for a publishing company. When I joined the product, it had been going for over a year and it had cost many millions of pounds. The way that I heard the story, a few months before I joined, there had been a show and tell meeting. It was an international company and it had offices in London and in New York. There were 3 people with American accents dialing in on a conference call. I don't know how much about what happened. I don't know much about what happened in that meeting. I do know that at some point, one of the Scrum Masters said he was going to share project progress. This was progress that had been made through the backlog. The backlog is the Agile way of saying the list of all the requirements for the project. But I'm not going to use that word anymore throughout the whole of this book, simply because it's one of those words which is used in Agile in a specific way, but seems to cause more confusion and difficulty than it does clarity and progress. So from now on, I'm going to use the phrase to-do list. And for each of the items in the to-do list, I'm going to call those to-do list items. So this Agile project manager, this Scrum Master, he had a presentation, edit. He had a presentation with some slides, and there was a bit of messing about setting up the presentation, and then making sure that it was shared with the office in New York. Finally, everything was set up, and the Scrum Master could move to the slide that showed the progress of the project. He clicked onto the slide. In the middle of the slide was a giant 2. I don't know how dramatic he was at this point. I don't know if he asked anybody in the room or on the phone if they could guess what the 2 meant. 2 weeks to finish, 2 months, 2 years. But I know that at some point he'd get the point across. Edit. The 2 was percent. Progress on the project. After 6 months and many millions of pounds, 2% of the work was all that was in the edit. 2% of the work was all that was completed from the to-do list. This is brutal transparency, and it probably came out of desperation. Having worked on that project, I can guess that someone had told the bosses in New York that the project would be finished by a certain date. Nobody had mentioned to the bosses the problems that were being found, problems that were slowing progress to a crawl. The main result of that number 2 was that the Scrum Master was never allowed to speak at a show and tell again. The bosses in New York hired a traditional project manager, in inverted commas, to communicate progress across the Atlantic. After that, guess what? The news was always good. This is what a friend of mine said about this meeting. I remember an explosion of anger over the phone where the entire team, 50 plus people, were dressed down and told to get on with it or heads will roll. But what does it tell us? What does it tell us about empirical process, transparency and adaptation? And in the end, what does that tell us about delivering the impossible? Okay, let's start here. I'm going to put on my magic fortune teller's hat and I'm going to look into your project. Actually, I don't need a funny hat and a cloak, and I don't need the strange noises. If you have a project and this project has yet to deliver its first live release, and that release has a deadline, I already know one thing about it. Your project is supposed to deliver n times more work than can possibly be delivered by the deadline. What's n? On a good project, n is 2 or 3. I've seen lots of projects where n is 7 or 8. On a project that I just told you about, where the Scrum Master brought up the 2% on the screen, n was somewhere between 25 and 50. But maybe I'm wrong about your project. Maybe your project is fine. Maybe you're reading a book called Delivering the Impossible out of idle curiosity. You wonder what it'd be like to work on those projects that seem impossible. But your project is fine. Maybe. But if your project isn't fine, what are you going to do about it? Telling it like it is, as the Scrum Master in the story tried to, doesn't seem to work that well. In that case, it resulted in the hiring of someone to specifically stop the bosses in New York being told the truth. Some senior person might well have promised something that is impossible to deliver. Edit. Getting them to deliver anything near that might be a difficult process, requiring careful handling. Yes, that's for the bosses. Diplomacy, tact, careful handling, and an understanding of the politics may well be required. But for the team that's doing the work, it's never a bad thing for the team to know the truth as soon as possible. If you're in charge of that team, you should keep the windscreens clean. You should take every chance to make sure that things are transparent. This means making sure that the meetings which aid transparency are happening. It means that people feel free to talk in the stand-up about any problems that they're coming across. It means people feel comfortable speaking out in retrospectives about anything else that might be bothering them. And it means that show and tells are honest about progress and show working software. The second thing to understand, is to understand that shouting out bad news in front of 50 people might not be the best way of communicating it. Here is where you might be a lot better at this than me. Like the guy in the 2 story, I'm not very diplomatic. Like the guy in the 2 story, I've nearly gotten fired for telling it like it is in front of the wrong audience. You might be more diplomatic. You might have a better way of dressing up the bad news. But here are some things that it's important to understand. Everybody in the room knew that Mr. 2 was right. The bosses in New York heard what he said. Unfortunately, the way that Mr. 2 said it was so confrontational that their reaction was exactly the wrong one. Their response was to hire someone to stop stop him telling the truth ever again. We started to talk about the rather jolly metaphor of driving a car as a way of thinking about empirical process. And by doing that, we've ended up at the absolute nitty-gritty of project management. To manage a project, you need transparency. When you achieve that transparency, you get bad news almost always. And then as a team, you have to do something with the bad news. What do you do with the bad news? So what was bad about what Mr. Two did? What was bad about what he did was that he upset the bosses. He made them feel stupid in front of the whole team. And the result of that was that when they made very sure that they didn't hear any news again from him. They appointed a project manager who never ever told them any bad news. Please note that this didn't mean that there was never any bad news. Of course, another thing that was bad about the situation was that it had been allowed to reach such a point. My guess is that this wasn't the first time that Mr. Two had tried to point out actual progress. He'd probably tried several times to make clear what the measures of actual progress meant for when the project would finish. Mr. Two's action was a reaction against a powerful top-to-bottom and probably top-down system of agreed activity. In the end, he was forced to shout out, "There's a pirate ship! Oh my God, there's a pirate ship! Can you see it?" What was good about what Mr. Two did was that he did manage to get a message to the bosses. And even if the result was that they made sure that they never again heard from him, there's no doubt that they heard it. And it's interesting to note they didn't fire him. Is there anything else he could have done that would have made the situation better? It seems that everybody in the organization didn't want to hear what he was saying. So what could he have done? Well, there are a few things, all of them partial but powerful. He could, and he should, have continued to keep track of the project's progress, even when the bosses had ignored him. Why? Because this is still useful information. Actual progress tells you not only when a project is likely to finish, but also how long any particular piece of work should take. He could have pushed more to get working software to where it finally needs to go. He could have done more to get it in the hands of real users, because real users were the people that the bosses had to listen to. And he shouldn't have taken it personally. It's easy to say that. From my experience, it's difficult to do it. Transparency, inspection, and adaptation is the best chance that you have of delivering a project. Whatever trouble your project is in, it's normally a good idea to increase these things. Are your stand-ups getting repetitive? Is nobody really saying anything then? Have battle lines been drawn over some disagreement so nobody is saying anything about it? What can be done differently to get around the problem? Okay, bunch of things to look at there, but very interesting. If you've seen this, thanks very much for watching. More tomorrow.